Euron Greyjoy stood at the prow of the Silence, the taste of salt and blood lingering on his tongue as a fierce wind whipped across the deck. His cloak snapped behind him, black as a raven's wing, and beneath it, splashes of red gleamed in the dying sunlight like ghostly rubies. The prow of his dread ship cut through the water with a hiss. The waves, once roiling gray under an endless sky, were now tinted red under the setting sun, as though the narrow sea itself bled for him. The war horn that had sounded his arrival in these waters was silent now, strapped to the waist of one of his faceless crew members, a trophy from a fallen foe long since forgotten. Euron was not a man who dwelled on the past for too long. He plundered it and moved forward. Yet something in his eyes reflected a secret knowledge, a grim satisfaction. He was no longer just the Crow's Eye, the infamous rogue of the Iron Islands, or even just a pretender to the Salt Throne. He was the master of these seas, self-proclaimed pirate king, and any captain foolish enough to cross him, be they from Braavos or King's Landing, from Old Town or Volantis, would bow or burn. Since his seizing of the Stepstones and the subsequent blockade of the southern coastline, every trade route that once hummed with the commerce of Essos and Westeros was stifled by fear. Sailors whispered of him as they once did of the Krakens from old tales. Unstoppable, inescapable, emerging from the deep with a hungry maw. But Euron's ambition was far more cunning and calculating than any monstrous sea beast. He demanded tribute from kings, lords, and merchants alike, and the cunning in his single blue eye, the other always hidden by his patch, embroidered with dark, swirling shapes reminiscent of tentacles, promised swift retribution to any who denied him. He had started this campaign not merely to gather gold or glory but to fulfill a more profound longing. He wanted to stand astride the known world and hold it by the throat. He was the storm that drowned the seas. Men could either kneel or perish. So far, nearly all had knelt. As the Silence glided onward, Euron turned his attention to the horizon. The last edges of sunlight vanished beneath the waves, leaving an eerie twilight, the faint glow of distant stars reflected on the calm surface. He had sent out orders to his raiding parties, scattered across the coasts. Now he awaited their return, eager to hear of the spoils, eager to hear the moans of those who failed to pay their share, eager to hear of fresh victories that would remind Westeros and Essos alike that the Pirate King ruled these waters. The hush that settled over the ship was broken only by the soft creak of its timbers and the low murmurs of his crew. They were a strange, motley lot, mutes, most of them, their tongues removed so none could betray their captain's secrets. In their eyes flickered devotion and terror alike. Even if they had tongues, they would have had precious little to say. Euron's presence inspired both awe and dread, the kind that made men fear sleep in case their dreams were disturbed by the Crow's Eye's haunting grin. He stepped down from the prow, scanning the deck with a predatory air. A large, salt-stained chest stood near the mainmast, locked with an iron clasp carved into the shape of kraken tentacles. Gold, jewels, scraps of Valyrian steel, exotic spices, spoils from the many merchant galleys he had seized. He kicked the chest once, and the iron clasps rattled as if cowering from his touch. To Euron, this hoard was simply a reminder of what Westeros was now forced to pay him, or see their ships aflame and their ports turned to rubble. At his gesture, one of his men approached. A slender figure with sunburned skin and a jagged scar across his cheek bowed his head. He could not speak, but he handed Euron a strip of parchment. The message upon it was scrawled in shaky letters, smudged by water. It bore the seal of a minor lord. A red fish, half-stripped by a kraken's curling limbs, and read, "We will pay." Euron's lips curled in satisfaction, and he crumpled the parchment in his fist. Another tribute secured, another petty lord who understood that defiance brought swift destruction. He turned to the chest and kicked it again, harder this time, as if the sound of rattling gold was a promise that all the lords of Westeros would soon echo in that same clamor of submission. When he returned to the prow, the wind had changed, carrying a distant stench of smoke on the breeze. He smiled thinly. The blockade was doing its work. Some fool somewhere had refused to bow, and one of his reaver captains had burned their ships to the waterline. Perhaps it was in the Stepstones or on one of the outlying coasts near Dorne, or even the Blackwater Bay. Euron did not care exactly where. The specifics only mattered so far as they told him if the tribute was being paid. He was content. Let the seas burn. Let the smoke mark his path. On Dragonstone, the painted table glowed in the torchlight, a perfect rendition of Westeros carved in with centuries earlier by order of Aegon the Conqueror. Though the castle's halls had been reclaimed by various rulers through the years, it was said that the painted table never changed. On its surface, tiny carved representations of mountains, rivers, and roads marched across the shape of the Seven Kingdoms. Now, incongruously placed across the seas of that map, small kraken sigils had been placed, little carved tokens hammered in, each marking a location of Euron's raiding fleets. Ser Davos Seaworth, standing near the head of the table, wore a frown that might have been carved in stone. He had grown older, lines etched deep into his face, his hair now more silver than black. But in his eyes there remained a fierce determination. The black-sailed ships that harried the coast of the Reach and the Stormlands made trade impossible. Even from this vantage, Davos could see how thoroughly Euron had choked the supply lines. The men and women around the table were a strange assembly of knights, lords, and small counselors from various corners of Westeros. They were here by invitation of the newly crowned king, whoever that might be at this point, for the Iron Throne had seen more than one claimant in the tumultuous months following a war that had left the realm battered. Scattered as the realm was, they had come to Dragonstone searching for solutions. The flicker of the torches highlighted their anxiety. "How many ships have been taken this past moon?" Davos asked in a calm, measured voice, though tension hid beneath every syllable. A portly man, clad in the colors of House Sunglass, consulted a scrap of parchment. "Near 40, Ser Davos. Grain ships from the Stormlands, spice galleys from Dorne, even some small fishing vessels along the Crownlands. It makes no difference to him. He captures them all, demands gold, fresh water, or supplies. If they refuse, they're scuttled. If they comply, they're allowed a single voyage. But word spreads that next time, even if they comply, he might take their cargo just for sport." A hush settled over the room. The painted table seemed to loom larger, as if the entire realm bore down on them. One of the lords, tall and lean, with steel-gray hair and a voice like distant thunder, broke the silence. "We must raise a fleet to challenge him," he said. "Surely the new king can rally enough ships from the Redwine Fleet, the Royal Navy, and the Arbor to break this blockade. We did so once, against the Ironborn in years past." A younger voice snapped. "We tried. Once before in Blackwater Bay. We lost half our forces and the other half retreated. Euron Greyjoy was ready for us. He used some infernal device, wildfire, some say, or potions from those warlocks he keeps close. Our ships burned like candles." Ser Davos rubbed his hand along his stubbled chin. "We can't launch a direct assault unless we're sure of success. Each time we fail, we lose more men, and it only emboldens him." Another whisper. "Would that we still had dragons or Daenerys Stormborn in her prime." A hush fell over the group, for dragons belonged to an age that had come and gone, and magic was fickle in these dark times. Davos reached forward, fingertips brushing over the portion of the painted table that depicted the stepstones. "He's made his stronghold here, among the scattered islands," Davos said. "He controls the crossing from Essos to Westeros. Any ship coming from the east must pass near them if they hope to dock at King's Landing or anywhere along the Narrow Sea. But that's not all, he has other enclaves too. He's claimed any deserted fortress along the coastline, turned them into pirate dens. The Iron Throne is starved of gold, no taxes flow in from trade. Our coffers dwindle." A woman in armor bearing a blue banner stepped forward. Lady Breen, they named her, though she was older than the legends told, her hair flecked with white. Her armor carried countless dents, each a story of her relentless dedication. "So we do nothing?" she asked, voice low. "We let him continue this chokehold?" Davos faced her. "No, my lady, we plan. If we move rashly, we only feed his legend. We must be cunning." He surrounded himself with Sellswords and Reavers from the Summer Islands to the Basilisk Isles. We can't rely on an overwhelming show of force unless we have the ships. But if we gather enough alliances, Bravos, Pentos, Lys, those cities have reason to resent him too. He raids their coasts with the same glee. Bravos, though, is rumored to be paying him. Why not, if tribute keeps them safe? Davos's lips thinned. Aye, that is his power. It's cheaper to pay a pirate once than to constantly lose fleets. That's how he's stayed afloat. Every house, city, and merchant that pays him in gold or provisions only fuels his next campaign. This is how he's fashioned himself as pirate king of the narrow sea. A hush spread again, the flame of the nearest torch guttering as though the wind itself was uncertain. Davos's eyes flicked around the chamber. We must be more cunning. We must disrupt his alliances, lure away his captains. But to do that, we need the Iron Throne strong. We need the realm at peace, not bickering over who sits on the damn chair in King's Landing. A nod passed among the lords and ladies present. Each had seen the ruin caused by the fragmentation of the realm. If there was one threat that might unite them, it was Euron Greyjoy. Euron's rise to power had been as swift and startling as a lightning strike across a stormy sky. It began with whispers, ships vanishing near the stepstones, minor lords complaining of raiders near their coasts. At first, none suspected it was anything more than typical Ironborn reaving. But the scale of the attacks grew. Galleons from Volantis, ships from Lys carrying precious cargo, caravels loaded with golden peppers from the Summer Islands. None were safe. Euron's black sails appeared in the night, silent but deadly. By the time the sun rose, the only remnants were burning hulls and floating corpses. Or, for the fortunate ships, the only sign of Euron's visit was a single scrap of parchment left behind, an edict demanding tribute. If the demands were met, the cargo would be allowed to pass. Fail, and the sea would devour them. Eventually, lords from the Reach and the Stormlands banded together to drive him out. But Euron's cunning was matched only by his ruthlessness. They found themselves in a labyrinth of hidden coves and razor-sharp rocks. Euron's lookouts spotted them far off, and when the lords' ships were forced into tight straits, the Ironborn unleashed catapults hurling pots of wildfire into their midst, igniting a floating inferno. The survivors who escaped told tales of a monstrous figure laughing among the flames, the reflection of emerald fire dancing in his single, gleaming eye. What truly broke the resolve of Westeros's defenders, however, was his shocking alliance with sell-sail companies from Essos. Euron promised them gold, plunder, and a share of the seas. Many captains bent the knee, or at least offered a formal handshake and a hidden vow. Soon, the black sails sailed alongside ships flying the banners of the Golden Company, the Stormcrows, and smaller free companies eager for coin. The once impenetrable alliance of Westeros's lords found itself outnumbered. Their tactics were ill-suited to fighting Euron's brand of piracy, which relied on speed, ambush, and fear. Then came the siege of King's Landing itself, though it was not a siege in the traditional sense. Euron's ships blockaded the mouth of the Blackwater Rush, and for weeks on end, no merchant ships could pass. Starvation in the city soared, and the king, whoever he was at the time, was forced to pay Euron an exorbitant sum to ensure grain shipments arrived. Euron collected the gold, departed, and then returned 2 moons later to threaten them again. By then, the city's coffers were all but empty, and the small folk were desperate. The Wolf of Winterfell, the Rose of Highgarden, or the Lion of Casterly Rock. No matter which sigil flew above the ramparts, the foe remained the same, the black kraken that strangled the sea. So it was that Euron declared himself Pirate King, openly mocking the Iron Throne's inability to repel him. He crowned himself with a circlet of black iron, studded with rubies that gleamed like drops of fresh blood. He used the tongues of foes to decorate the silence. Over time, the black-sailed dreadship became a symbol of terror, and the name Euron Greyjoy was whispered with a tremor across every tavern from Lannisport to Bravos. In the moonlit cabin of the silence, Euron allowed himself a rare moment of reverie. He sat on a throne-like chair carved of driftwood and inlaid with the teeth of his enemies, some human, some beast, and sipped a goblet of wine as dark as night. The cabin was more spacious than most captains could dream, yet it was cluttered with trophies and artifacts. Skulls of exotic creatures lined shelves next to jars of strange potions and oddities collected in his travels. A weathered Valyrian steel dagger rested on a velvet cushion, and a battered horn rumored to be from a dragon lay coiled in the corner, etched with glowing runes that shifted whenever Euron's gaze lingered too long. He drank and listened to the wind outside. The grin on his lips was slow and satisfied. The sea had grown quiet. That was good. Quiet seas meant fewer storms to toss his ships. The storms, after all, were his domain, but it was best they came at his choosing, not nature's. His thoughts meandered to the future, to conquests yet unclaimed. Let Westeros pay him tribute. Let the free cities cower in fear. He had greater ambitions still. Perhaps he would find a way to unearth the secrets of old Valyria, or even force the Unsullied in distant Meereen to pay for his protection. Why limit himself to the narrow sea? He had glimpsed wonders beyond the Basilisk Isles, rumored lands in the Far East. Perhaps, in time, he would control them as well. For Euron, the entire world was a ripe fruit waiting to be plucked. A scraping noise outside the cabin made him rise. One of his mutes stood in the doorway, eyes downcast. The man held a scrap of sailcloth with a small medallion pressed into it. Euron recognized the sigil. A golden hand and a spiked crown. Some petty new claimant to the Iron Throne. Or was it the old one who'd changed his heraldry in desperation? They came and went so frequently these days, Euron had lost track. He waved the crewman in. The man laid the offering at Euron's feet, then backed away silently. Euron stooped to pick up the medallion. It was heavy, real gold, engraved with the words, "In friendship and fealty." He snorted. A coward's gift. A bribe for safe passage, no doubt. Euron preferred more direct forms of tribute, but perhaps he would accept this for the moment. He enjoyed toying with them, letting them think gold could buy his mercy. He let the medallion slip through his fingers and clatter onto a table. Then he dismissed the crewman with a flick of his gloved hand. Solitude returned. Euron leaned back in his throne, goblet in hand, and allowed a laugh to echo in the cramped cabin. Soon enough, more tributes would come. Word of Euron's dominion spread far and wide. In Old Town, the Citadel's archmasters muttered darkly about the decline of knowledge and commerce. If the seas were closed, how would their agents travel to gather lore, or how would books from distant lands arrive? Even the ravens seemed restless. Records from scattered maesters reported that entire families had been cut off from communication, their only link to the rest of the realm severed by lack of safe passage. In the Stormlands, harvests rotted in warehouses near the docks, their usual route to the Crownlands blocked. The Stormlander lords grumbled that if the crown could not break Euron's hold, perhaps they should not pay taxes at all. In the Reach, the famed Red Wine fleet guarded the arbor, but the fruit of the vineyards found fewer markets. Ships that did dare the crossing paid Euron steep fees, passing the cost onto the Westerosi lords who bought the wine. The price of arbor gold soared beyond the means of all but the wealthiest. In Dorne, the Martells had fewer direct dealings with Euron. Most of their trade came overland or through lesser ports in the Summer Sea, but even they began to feel the pinch. If they wanted goods from the free cities, they needed to sail the narrow sea at some point. Prince Corin Martell seethed at the insult of paying a Greyjoy, but he also knew that Euron's reavers had no scruples about pillaging Dorne if they refused. The Iron Throne itself, though battered by years of conflict and transitions of power, found itself at a crossroads. King or queen, whoever had managed to cling to that seat, needed to decide whether to muster the realm's battered fleets for another assault or to negotiate with the Pirate King. But how does one negotiate with a figure who thrives on chaos, whose cruelty is matched only by his unpredictability? Night blanketed the shipbreaker bay, stars glittering over a dark sea. On the horizon, a single pinpoint of light flickered. Slowly, it grew into a lantern hanging from the prow of a small skiff. Aboard it were two men, hunched and silent, rowing with slow, deliberate strokes. They approached the looming shape of a warship painted dark gray, anchored a short distance from the coastline. As they neared, a rope ladder descended, and the men tossed up a small bag. It landed on the deck with a muffled jingle. Gold. Payment to be allowed safe passage into Shipbreaker Bay with their cargo of Stormlander grain. No voice hailed them. No words of acceptance were spoken. Only the quiet grunt of men hauling up the bag. Then the skiff was allowed to pass, unseen but not unobserved. Hidden among the rigging, iron-born archers watched, the faint shimmer of steel in their hands. Had the gold been insufficient, or the men proven hostile, the archers would have loosed a rain of arrows that left the skiff sinking. These sorts of nighttime exchanges had become common all along the coasts. The lords and merchants cursed Euron's name but were forced into this humiliating dance. Pay or perish, kneel or burn. Euron's dominion extended like a spider's web, each strand a shipping lane, each trembling strand ferrying his gold. On the deck of a captured galley near the stepstones, Euron inspected his prizes. Casks of Dornish wine, fresh fruit from the Reach, crates of steel weapons from the forges of the Crownlands. He idly stabbed a fruit with a short blade, lifting it to his lips. He took a slow, deliberate bite, letting the juice dribble down his chin. Then he tossed the fruit overboard, that single chunk missing, the rest devoured by the sea. His satisfaction grew each day, fueled by the knowledge that no single faction in Westeros had yet found a way to oust him. They bickered among themselves, trying to restore stability after the previous wars. Euron was the beneficiary of their disunity. No matter how many knights or lords cursed his name, he remained out of their reach. The irony was a fine vintage, sweeter than any arbor red. But Euron was not content to merely gather gold and taunt lords. He wanted to turn the realm's fear into something deeper: submission, worship. He wanted to be more than a king of pirates. He wanted to transcend the mortal coil. He had studied arcane lore on his voyages to Essos, delved into ancient texts in Ass High, consulted with warlocks in Karth who possessed knowledge older than the Valyrian freehold. Euron's ambitions went beyond the mundane trappings of wealth and power. He had glimpsed something darker in those half-whispered incantations, something he believed might elevate him to a living god if only he had the right ingredients. He glanced at one of his mute crewmen, a wiry man named Left Hand Lucas. Lucas was missing not just his tongue, but his left hand as well. Euron had taken it in a fit of anger months ago. Now Lucas served him as though enthralled, eyes glazed over with a mix of reverence and terror. Euron's single eye gleamed under his patch. Perhaps it was nearly time for the next step: blood magic, sacrifice, the kind of rituals that might echo through the ages. But he was patient. He would gather the items he needed: the horn, the Valyrian artifacts, the tomes. Then, when the time was ripe, he would strike at the very notion of mortality itself. Meanwhile, Davos Seaworth embarked on a covert mission. In a battered fishing skiff, he and a small band of trusted men slipped away from Dragonstone under cover of darkness. Their destination: the city of Lys in the Summer Sea, where rumors claimed some of Euron's Selsale allies had grown dissatisfied. If Davos could broker an arrangement, perhaps they could sow seeds of discord among Euron's ranks. The Pirate King thrived on terror and gold, but if his men believed they could secure a better deal elsewhere, or if some among them feared retribution from a united Westeros, they might jump ship, so to speak. Davos was aware this was a dangerous gambit. Betraying Euron Greyjoy was akin to painting a target on one's back. But if enough captains could be enticed to break away, Euron's blockade might weaken. Davos clung to hope as fiercely as any drowning man clings to driftwood. The sea was indeed a watery grave for many, but for him, it had always been a path to salvation. Once as a smuggler who fed a starving city, and now as a would-be savior against the Black Kraken's dominion. The crossing to Lys took them around the peninsula of Dorne, far from prying eyes. Davos used old smuggling routes, relying on knowledge from his younger days. Though they spotted black-sailed ships in the distance, they managed to avoid them by sailing in daylight when Euron's men typically rested in hidden coves or busied themselves terrorizing other targets. They arrived in Lys battered by storms and bone-tired, but alive. In a smoke-filled tavern near the docks, Davos met with a ragged Selsale captain named Addario. Addario had once served the Golden Company, but rumor held that he and a handful of others had left that storied group to follow a more profitable route under Euron's shadow. Yet Addario's face told a story of regret. With each drink, the Lycine's tongue grew looser, describing how Euron's unpredictability had cost him a quarter of his men. They had boarded a merchant ship rumored to carry hidden Valyrian treasures. The rumor turned out false, and Euron, enraged at the waste of time, had burned 3 sell-sail ships for no reason other than whimsy. When Davos carefully suggested that Westeros might pay a sum for certain services, like turning on Euron during a critical moment, Addario was silent at first. Then he gave a slow nod. "It would cost more than gold alone," he murmured. "There is fear, and fear is a powerful chain. But if you can guarantee we won't be flayed alive by that demon, we might listen." Davos nodded somberly, aware of the risk, but a spark of optimism flickered in his chest. This could be a start. If even a small part of Euron's alliance fractured at the right time, a coordinated strike might succeed. Unbeknownst to Davos, watchers in the Lysine docks took notice of his visit. Word traveled through the labyrinth of informants until it reached an individual loyal to Euron Greyjoy, a gaunt Myrish sellsword with a penchant for cruelty. The merman dispatched a raven to the Pirate King's hidden fortress in the Stepstones, reporting that an envoy of Westeros was conspiring with certain captains. If there was one thing Euron hated more than defiance, it was betrayal from those who had once served him. At the fortress, an ancient ruin perched on a jagged outcrop of rock, Euron stood amid half-collapsed walls, the wind howling through empty windows like lost souls. The raven's message arrived. As he read it, his lips curved in a snarl. So the Onion Knight dared meddle in his affairs? And some of his own captains considered treachery? He looked up at the ruin that he had made his seat of power, the tattered banners of House Greyjoy flapping above the battered ramparts. The sky overhead was heavy with storm clouds, and the smell of brine and decay drifted in the wind. Leaning against a half-toppled pillar was the great war horn he had once seized from the smoking ruins of a warlock's tower in Karth. He had not used its power yet. The lore in the ancient glyphs suggested the horn could bind monstrous forces, or perhaps even dragons if they still existed. But Euron understood that even false rumors of such power could serve him well. Sometimes fear of what might be was as potent as the real thing. Yet now, the time approached when he might need to demonstrate that his cruelty had no limits. He would do more than burn a few ships. He would make an example so grand that the entire realm, and any sell-sail with second thoughts, would remember who truly ruled the narrow sea. He summoned a group of ironborn captains, men whose loyalty was absolute. He told them to assemble a fleet of 20 ships and sail to Lys. If they discovered any sign of treachery, they were to raise the harbor, capturing or killing every Lysine sellsword suspected of collusion. Let the world see how quickly Euron punished conspiracies against him. His captains saluted with savage glee. They lived for mayhem, and Euron let them go, his mind drifting toward the next stage of his plan. Perhaps the time was ripe to impose new conditions on the lords of Westeros. The old tribute was too lenient. Maybe he would demand a direct vow from each lord, sealed by the blood of their heirs. Let them bleed, let them quake in terror, until they bowed in the dust whenever his name was spoken. Some days later, Davos and Addario concluded their negotiations in a hidden wine cellar in Lys. They established a code. At the next large-scale confrontation, Addario and a handful of other captains would side with Westeros, turning the tide at a crucial moment in exchange for generous rewards. Davos was no stranger to backroom deals. He understood the precarious line he walked, but it was their best shot. He had enough gold and promises from the new royal advisors to make it plausible. Addario only demanded that Westeros provide them official pardons for any crimes committed under Euron's flag. Davos gave his word, though inwardly he doubted if any signature or seal would hold up once the dust settled. All might be moot if Euron emerged victorious again. They parted ways. Davos planned a stealthy return to Dragonstone. But before he could slip away, word spread that a black-sailed squadron had been sighted off the coast, heading straight for Lys. The city's defenses were minimal. Lys prided itself on beauty and commerce, not war. Panicked, the Lyseni captains rushed to gather their ships. Some fled outright, setting sail for other free cities. Others tried to muster a defense in the harbor. Davos stood on the docks, cursing under his breath. If Euron had discovered their plot, any hope of turning these sell sails would evaporate in the fires of retribution. Sure enough, by the time the Ironborn fleet appeared on the horizon, the defenders were in disarray. Euron's ships descended like a flock of ravens upon a dying carcass, black sails filling the harbor with dread. Aboard a hastily armed merchant galley, Davos helped man the ballista. His old smuggler's heart pounded as he glanced at Adario's ship. The Lysene sell sail had only a fraction of his crew aboard. Many were scattered across the city. If the Ironborn boarded them now, it would be a slaughter. On the lead Ironborn ship, Davos recognized the sigil of House Greyjoy, a golden kraken on black. Euron was not personally there, but his presence was felt in every flaming arrow that streaked across the sky, in every savage battle cry that echoed over the water. The Ironborn began their assault with brutal efficiency. Fire pots crashed into the docks, setting them ablaze. Men screamed as they leapt from the piers into the water, only to be shot down by arrows. Addario tried to rally his men, urging them to fight back. A few Lysene archers launched volleys, managing to strike some Ironborn on the decks. But the tide quickly turned. The Ironborn had better discipline in naval warfare, and Lys had been caught unprepared. Davos and his men fired the ballista, sending a harpoon crashing through the hull of an approaching Ironborn longship. It began to take on water. A small cheer arose from Davos's crew, but it died quickly when two more Ironborn longships emerged, their grappling hooks and boarding planks ready. Fighting erupted at close quarters. Davos drew his sword, cursing the years that had slowed his arm. Still, he parried an Ironborn's wild slash and stabbed the man in the stomach. Blood slicked the deck. Another attacker loomed, a hulking brute with an axe. Davos narrowly sidestepped, wincing at the jolt of pain in his old injuries. One of his companions tackled the brute from behind, and Davos took the opening to slash the man's throat. A spray of blood, a gurgle, and the brute collapsed. Chaos and smoke filled the harbor. Flames leapt from ship to ship, turning the water into a reflection of hellish orange. Davos realized the entire effort to secure Lys's help might be undone. Only a narrow path remained if they were to salvage anything. They had to flee and regroup. He shouted to Addario that they needed to retreat. The Lysene captain hesitated, gazing at his city's burning skyline. Then he gave the order. Their battered ships raised sails and fought to escape. Ironborn longships pursued them, black silhouettes among the flames. Through a stroke of luck and wind, Davos's galley managed to slip beyond the harbor, though an Ironborn arrow grazed his shoulder, sending a flare of pain down his arm. Addario's vessel was close behind, but many Lysene ships fell behind or were boarded. The night was filled with screams and the crackling roar of flames. By dawn, the battered survivors regrouped miles offshore. Smoke still drifted on the horizon. Lys had suffered a grave blow, enough to cow them into compliance with Euron's demands for the foreseeable future. Davos's heart sank. He knew their budding conspiracy was in tatters. Yet Addario approached him, eyes rimmed with anger and sorrow. "We still want out of Euron's yoke," Addario said, voice raw. "Many of my men are dead, but those who survive won't forget what he did tonight." Davos nodded. That was something, at least. The seeds of vengeance had been sown. Perhaps, with time, they would blossom into a dagger in Euron's back. Far to the north, in the once proud city of White Harbor, the Manderleys chafed under the blockade's ripple effects. Their trade with the south had slowed to a trickle. Lord Desmond Manderley paced in his solar, ringed fingers tapping a table strewn with letters from merchants bemoaning the rising cost of goods. Even the north felt Euron's shadow, despite the distance. If they wanted to import grains or textiles from the south, the ships risked crossing the narrow sea or hugging the coastline, each route subject to Euron's blockade. The lords of the north had never been seafaring folk, but many possessed sturdy warships. If the king in the north, a newly resurrected title, half formal, half defiant, decided to take action, he could muster a small fleet. But traveling south to do battle with Euron in foreign waters was a tall order. The North's energies were consumed with rebuilding after the previous wars. Morale was low. The White Harbor fleets spent most of their time defending fishing vessels near the mouth of the White Knife from occasional Ironborn raids. Still, rumors reached White Harbor that certain southern lords were forging alliances with Bravos. House Manderly watched, intrigued. If the Bravosi refused to keep paying Euron's tribute, they had the largest navy in the known world. Could that be the key to toppling the Pirate King? Lord Desmond toyed with the idea of aligning with Bravos if the time came. Until then, he would sit and watch. The North had learned patience the hard way, through bitter winters and betrayals. Euron's fortress in the Stepstones now bristled with stolen armaments. Heavy scorpions, seized from the wreckage of old sieges, lined the walls. Iron spikes and monstrous effigies of the Kraken studded the parapets. Pirate banners fluttered in the harsh winds, each representing a faction or sell-sail group that had bent the knee. Within the fortress, Euron's men feasted on stolen delicacies, drank casks of arbor wine, and boasted of their exploits. At the heart of the main keep, Euron retreated to a circular chamber that had once served as an audience hall centuries ago when the fortress had legitimate lords. The ceiling was half collapsed, revealing a patch of sky that let in sunlight or rain without discretion. Torchlight flickered along the stone walls, throwing shadows that danced like wraiths. Laid out on a large table were fragments of old parchment, lines of Valyrian script, glyphs from shadowy places far beyond the known world. Euron traced a finger along them, a distant look in his eye. He had never been much for reading, but in his travels, he had learned bits of languages, gleaned pieces of knowledge. Enough to know that the lines referred to a mighty summoning, an invocation that demanded a sacrifice of blood and spirit. He grinned to himself. He had no illusions that his men would understand or condone these dabblings. They were content with gold and fear, but Euron wanted more. He had glimpsed the supernatural side of the world, seen warlocks conjure illusions, heard whispered tales of greenseers and skin-changers in the far north, felt the presence of dark powers in the ruins of Valyria. If those energies could be tamed, harnessed, he might ascend beyond mortal limits. Then all the gold of the world would be but a trifle, and all the seas would bow before him as if he were a god made flesh. He pictured the day when the lords of Westeros would not merely pay him tribute but kneel in reverence, offering their firstborn sons as sacrifices. The thought sent a thrill through him, like the sweet rush of a potent drug. One of his closest lieutenants, Caro, a towering man from the Summer Isles with a face scarred by some exotic creature's claws, approached him hesitantly. "Captain," he said in a low voice. Caro was one of the few allowed to speak, his tongue intact. "News from the west. A rumor that a Westerosi envoy is forging alliances with discontent sell-sails." Euron turned slowly, a dangerous gleam in his eye. "They whisper of betrayal. Good. Let them whisper. They will see how empty their rebellion is when their allies burn." Caro nodded. "We took Lys. We can do the same to any other city that defies us. But the men grow restless. They say you keep the best plunder for yourself, that you have your mind on other things." "The men will have their share of wealth," Euron replied with a cold smile. "We feast again tomorrow, distribute the spoils from Lys. Then we sail to raid another port. Let them have their fill of blood and gold, and they will stay loyal. As for the rest..." He laughed, a sound that sent a chill through Caro, a man not easily shaken. "Let them talk. If they dare raise a hand against me, I will tear out their eyes and feed them to the gulls." Caro inclined his head. He knew better than to question Euron. "Yes, Captain." With that, Euron returned to his parchments, his mind drifting again to the arcane. If he could keep his men in check a while longer, buy time with plunder and fear, he might be able to complete his grand design. Already, his connections in the free cities had begun to yield fruit. A warlock in Pentos had sent him a cryptic letter suggesting the existence of a relic tied to dragons of old, hidden in the painted mountains of Essos. If he possessed a relic like that, and with the horn he had, Perhaps he could call forth a terror to darken the skies. Or at least make the entire realm believe he could. In King's Landing, the Red Keep's throne room was a shell of what it had once been. The gilded pillars were tarnished, the floor marred by scorch marks from a battle waged months earlier. The occupant of the Iron Throne, an uneasy alliance of houses, had placed the dashing Lord Ricker upon it, sat with a haggard expression. He was not a man of war or cunning, but rather a placeholder who had some claim through marriage and luck. The realm was fractious, and in all but name the monarchy was fragile. Before him knelt 3 emissaries from the major houses, Tyrell, Tarly, and Redwine, each delivering demands for a more forceful approach to the pirate menace. Their lands in the Reach were hardest hit by the trade blockade. The king's small council hovered in the background, whispering among themselves, uncertain how to proceed. "We must call on all lords to assemble a grand fleet," insisted the Tyrell emissary, a spindly older lord who wore a rose sigil on his doublet. "Crush the Iron-born under sheer numbers." A Redwine lord shook his head, exasperated. "We tried. The last time cost us half the fleet of the Arbor. Euron's men were waiting, and if the rumors are true, they had wildfire. There must be a more cunning plan. Perhaps infiltration. Sabotage." Tarly's representative, a stout woman with cropped gray hair, spoke up. "In the days of old, we might have reached out to the Citadel for advanced weaponry or knowledge. But the Citadel stands neutral. Maester's counsel, they do not wage war. And in any event, Euron's foothold is too great. We must be realistic. If a direct assault is doomed, and sabotage uncertain, perhaps we must treat with him." A ripple of shock passed through the throne room. Lord Ricker stared, sweat beading on his brow. "Treat with Euron Greyjoy, who styles himself Pirate King?" He let out a shaky breath. "He demands gold, but more than that, he demands submission. Would we not be handing the realm over to him in all but name?" The Tarly emissary lowered her head. "Better that than watch it burn, unless we discover a miraculous new way to break him." Lord Ricker looked around, desperation written on his features. No answer came. No champion stepped forward promising to slay the Black Kraken. The memory of Euron's blockade still loomed over them. The gold in the royal treasury was nearly depleted. Whispers among the small council sug. Stead, the city might soon be unable to afford bread for the small folk. Another blockade could starve them into surrender once more. At length, with a pained expression, Lord Ricker lifted a trembling hand. "We will attempt diplomatic overtures. If he will parley, let us see what price he demands to leave the realm in peace." A stony silence followed. No one looked pleased, but at last they nodded, each acknowledging the grim necessity. Euron heard of the message from King's Landing through couriers who sailed under a flag of truce. He was feasting in his fortress hall, a goblet of black wine in one hand, a platter of freshly roasted boar before him. His men caroused around long tables, singing ribald songs and hurling bones at each other in jest. He read the letter with a sneer. They wanted to treat. They asked him to name his price. He stood, kicking his chair back, and bellowed for silence. The men quieted. Silence fell. Euron lifted the letter as if it were a trophy. "King's Landing begs for peace," he roared, laughter in his voice. "They cower behind their walls, and they want to buy our forbearance. Shall we let them?" A roar of derision rose from the hall. Tankards slammed the tables. Shouts of "never" and "make them kneel" rang out. Euron's grin widened. He tore the letter in half, letting the scraps flutter to the straw-covered floor. Then he raised his goblet. "We will give them our answer in fire and blood. But first, let the messenger see that we are merciful kings. We will name a price. They must give us hostages, heirs of the great houses, to ensure their good conduct. And a yearly tribute of gold, let's say triple what they've given so far. We will bleed them dry. If they refuse, we burn their ports. If they agree, we become the true power in the realm, with every house enthralled." His men cheered, stomping boots on the floorboards until the fortress walls seemed to shake. Euron basked in their adulation, every bit the triumphant conqueror. But inwardly, his mind drifted again to the deeper powers he sought. The realm's submission was a necessary step, but not the final one. Months passed, and Euron's demands weighed on Westeros like chains. Many lords balked at the notion of surrendering hostages. Rival factions blamed each other for the realm's vulnerability. Another wave of local conflicts threatened to erupt. Yet more rebellious voices insisted they must fight Euron to the last breath. Better to die on one's feet than live on one's knees. Some openly accused the Iron Throne of cowardice for entertaining Euron's terms. Amid this discord, Davos Seaworth labored in secret to assemble a final coalition. He traveled from Dragonstone to Storm's End, from Storm's End to the Arbor, from the Arbor to Sunspear, forging uneasy alliances with lords who had once been at each other's throats. Bits of rumor about Euron's cruelty, about the vile rites he might be planning, about the betrayals he inflicted on those who served him. These rumors convinced some to join Davos's cause. Others needed gold or trade concessions, or assurance that they would not be left defenseless if the plan failed. The plan was audacious. Lure Euron out with a false display of surrender in Blackwater Bay, while a combined fleet of Westerosi ships waited near Dragonstone, hidden by a thick fog. At the same time, the Sell-Sails in Euron's ranks who secretly conspired with Davos would sabotage the Pirate King's coordination, ensuring that at least part of his fleet would either hesitate or turn coat. Then, with a concentrated strike, they would smash Euron's forces in one fell swoop. It was a gamble of epic proportions. If it failed, the realm might be doomed to indefinite servitude under the Black Kraken. If it succeeded, Euron's blockade would shatter. Preparations went quietly but swiftly. The newly allied lords gathered in secret coves along the coast, their fleets anchored in tight formation to avoid detection. Pinnaces scouted the seas, ensuring no black sails prowled nearby. The Sell-Sails loyal to Euron were watched carefully. No one wanted to tip the plan by letting rumors slip. Finally, a heavily defended merchant convoy departed from the Arbor, supposedly bound for King's Landing with the first installment of Euron's demanded tribute: chests of gold, caskets of wine, barrels of precious spices. The rumor was spread widely. The realm had capitulated, agreeing to pay. All that remained was the official exchange in Blackwater Bay. Euron's spies took the bait, carrying the news back to him. Euron was delighted. He prepared a show of force, sending out a large portion of his fleet, the Silence at its head, to meet this tribute in Blackwater Bay. He intended to demand the presence of highborn hostages. If the Iron Throne refused to hand them over, he would unleash slaughter on the waiting ships. At dawn, Euron's black sails appeared at the mouth of the Blackwater Rush. The river banks, once the site of a famous battle, still bore scars from old wars. On the ramparts of King's Landing, battered watchers peered in dread at the approaching silhouette of the Silence, the monstrous figurehead shaped like a screaming visage. Faint horns signaled from Euron's ships. On the city walls, archers stood ready, though many doubted they could stop the black sails if it came to open conflict. Euron glided into the bay with a triumphant grin. He spotted the merchant convoy floating near the city, escorted by a token force of royal war galleys. The wind carried the stench of fear. Overhead, the sky was gray, clouds scudding across a pale sun. Euron felt the old thrill of impending chaos. Soon, the chests of gold would be his. Soon, the realm would place its neck under his boot. An envoy approached in a smaller boat, hoisting a white flag. A royal herald stammered out that the tribute was ready, but the king needed assurance that Euron would spare the city. Euron smirked, making a grand show of considering the offer. He demanded that the king himself come down to the docks with the heirs of major houses in tow, to be handed over. All eyes watched the city walls. If the king complied, it would be the greatest humiliation the Iron Throne had ever endured. For a moment, Euron actually believed it might happen. He could almost taste the sweet tears of the kneeling king, the wails of highborn hostages torn from their families. But then something caught his eye, a sudden, frantic commotion among his rearguard ships. Euron whirled, scanning the bay. Out of the haze behind them, sails emerged, hundreds of them. A combined fleet from the Reach, the Stormlands, Dorne, and even some banners he recognized from the north. The watchers on the city walls erupted into shouts. The largest naval force Westeros had mustered in decades, bearing down on Euron's unsuspecting forces. He bared his teeth in an angry snarl. He had been lured into a trap. From the corner of his vision, he saw a second wave of ships surging out from behind the rocky outcrops near Dragonstone. Davos Seaworth stood on the prow of one, face grim. Euron realized too late that these were the rumored traitors among his Selsail allies. They were turning on him, their flags raised in open defiance. Confusion rippled through the iron-born lines as they struggled to sort friend from foe. Euron's mind whirled. He still had a formidable fleet. If he could rally them, he might smash through the smaller portion of the Allied fleet and escape to open water, regrouping. Then he'd retaliate. But as he barked orders for the silence to come about, more chaos ensued. Some of his own captains hesitated, uncertain if this was a battle they could win. Others panicked, trying to break formation. The Selsail ships in his ranks sowed even more confusion, turning their weapons on the Ironborn at critical moments. In the city, archers and scorpions on the walls fired flaming arrows, launching them into the bay. Though not as devastating as wildfire, the volley was enough to set some confusion among Euron's rearguard. With a savage roar, Euron ordered the silence to ram through any ship that stood in its path. The dread ship surged forward, raking a smaller war galley from the Stormlands. Men screamed as the hull splintered. Euron laughed at their misery, but deep in his gut, a rare flicker of uncertainty took hold. This was no ordinary foe easily scattered by fear. They had planned meticulously and chosen the field of battle. One by one, Euron's ships found themselves engaged with the Allied fleet in a swirling melee. The clamor of steel, the crack of timbers, the roar of flames. Blackwater Bay became a crucible of blood and fire. Euron fought like a demon on the deck of the Silence, personally leading boarding parties onto enemy vessels. His men, fueled by fear and loyalty to their monstrous captain, fought with fanatical vigor. They seized 2 war galleys and sank a third, but the Allied numbers were overwhelming. Near midday, the wind shifted, blowing the smoke from the burning ships across the bay. Euron coughed, cursing the stinging haze that obscured his vision. The Silence listed slightly to starboard, hull battered. He bellowed for a damage report, but his mutes could only gesture desperately at the gushing leaks. They were patching it with pitch, but the tide of the battle was turning. He spotted Davos Seaworth's ship among the Allied lines, the old knight with a sword in hand. Euron's lips peeled back in a snarl. This was the man, he realized, who had orchestrated the trap. The Onion Knight. There was a savage satisfaction in the thought of slaying him, but the swirling mass of warships made it impossible to steer the Silence directly at Davos's vessel. As the hours ground on, the sea red with blood, Euron realized he was running out of time. If he didn't retreat soon, he risked losing everything. But retreat to where? The Allied fleets had encircled him with cunning. He roared at his men to break out, ordering them to follow him in a tight wedge formation. Some ships tried, but confusion reigned. Others were boarded and taken. Some sank beneath the waves, flotsam and corpses drifting in a grim mosaic. The Silence herself took 2 more direct hits from scorpions on the city walls, the giant bolts lodging in her hull. Euron, furious, had them hacked free, but water began to surge in. Yet the Pirate King refused to yield. He raised a horn to his lips, the twisted, runic horn from Karth, and blew. A deep, eerie bellow reverberated across the bay, a sound that set nerves on edge. For a moment, it seemed as though shadows flickered beneath the waves, some monstrous shape half-glimpsed. But no kraken or leviathan emerged to rescue Euron. Perhaps the magic was a hoax, or perhaps the ritual was incomplete. Regardless, the Allied fleets pressed their advantage. At last, the Silence was nearly surrounded. Euron stood on the prow, face streaked with blood and soot, cloak tattered. An arrow jutted from his left arm, but he seemed not to feel it. "We fight to the last," he roared to his crew. "Better to drown in the sea than kneel." The Ironborn manning the oars rowed desperately, trying to ram one more enemy ship. They succeeded in crashing into a smaller vessel from the Stormlands, splintering it into driftwood. But the silence, riddled with holes, began to list dangerously. Euron cursed as water sloshed around his feet on the deck. The sails were aflame in places, the black cloth turning to ash. Mutes scrambled, trying to douse the fire with seawater, but it was hopeless. Aboard one of the Allied flagships, horns sounded again. A voice called for Euron Greyjoy to surrender, promising fair treatment if he yielded. Euron spat into the water. The notion of surrender was an insult he would not abide. He glanced around. The once proud Black Fleet he commanded was in tatters. Here and there, a few Ironborn longships still fought, but they were heavily outnumbered and surrounded. Some, he knew, had already turned tail and fled, if they could. In a final act of defiance, Euron seized the war horn again and blew a second, thunderous note. The unholy sound rolled across the bay, making friend and foe alike shiver. Then, with a mad laugh, Euron tossed the horn into the sea. He stepped to the ship's rail. One of the Allied ships, bearing the sigil of House Velaryon, drew near, grappling hooks rattling across the Silence's sides. Armored men prepared to board, hoping to capture the pirate king alive. Euron drew his curved Valyrian steel sword, Nightfall it was said to be, and met the first wave of attackers with lethal skill. Even gravely wounded, he cut men down with a ferocity that bordered on supernatural. He roared curses at them, spitting blood, daring them to face him. The deck beneath his boots tilted further as the Silence took on more water. At last, as the hull cracked with a splintering groan, the Silence began to sink beneath the waves. Euron stood at the prow, grinning like a demonic wraith. The Allied fighters hesitated, some leaping from the ship's deck to avoid the sudden plunge. Euron laughed, a wild sound. "The sea is mine," he shouted. "I am the storm, the kraken, the king." With that, the prow dipped sharply, foam cresting over the rail. The ship sank, dragging Euron Greyjoy with it into the depths of Blackwater Bay. Some said they saw him still laughing as the waves swallowed him, saw his single blue eye gleaming with unholy light. Others claimed he wrestled a boarder into the deep, determined to kill one last foe in his final moments. None could say for certain if he died or if he found some watery fate below. The Silence vanished into the dark water, leaving only wreckage in its wake. The aftermath of the battle was both triumphant and grim. The Allied fleet had shattered Euron's blockade, liberating the narrow sea at last. Dozens of pirate vessels were captured or sunk. But the cost was high. Many Allied ships burned, and hundreds of good men lay dead. Smoke lingered over the bay, a mournful haze. Without Euron's leadership, the Ironborn reaving parties scattered. Some tried to hold out in hidden coves, but with the realm now united in vengeance, they were systematically hunted down or forced to flee across the sea. The tribute system collapsed, trade routes reopened, and commerce slowly resumed. King's Landing, battered but relieved, celebrated a victory that might finally bring stability. Davos Seaworth stood on a quay, exhausted but satisfied. The battered realms had finally set aside their differences to defeat a common foe. House alliances were still fragile, but for once, they had achieved something monumental by working together. As he gazed out over the water, he wondered if Euron truly was gone. The man had cheated death before, surviving storms and curses that would fell a lesser soul. But the bay had claimed the Silence, and no sign of Euron's body washed ashore. Rumors spread. Some insisted Euron's drowned corpse would wander the sea forever, dragging sailors to watery graves. Others believed he had escaped, swimming underwater like a sea demon, bound for distant lands to plot his return. But as the days turned into weeks, and the blockade ended without any sign of the Pirate King's black sails, hope dawned that the nightmare was indeed over. The Iron Islands themselves erupted in turmoil, uncertain who would next don the driftwood crown. Some said that Euron's seat as Pirate King was cursed, and none dared claim it lest they meet his fate. Others believed the Ironborn should renounce that savage path and seek a new age of peace. But no matter their choice, the realm beyond was done bending its knee to the Kraken. Still, many whispered that Euron had been more than just a pirate. He had sought darker powers, had glimpsed forbidden secrets. In the black depths below the bay, the wreck of the Silence might yet hold relics of unspeakable evil, waiting for some foolish soul to retrieve them. Tales of the runic horn he had cast into the waters spread among maesters and mystics, fueling speculation that if it were ever found, the nightmares might begin anew. For now, however, the seas were free of Euron's tyranny. The realm's lords and small folk alike rejoiced, though scarred by the harrowing months of forced tribute. Ships sailed once more without black krakens haunting their wake, and ports bustled with renewed trade. King's Landing saw caravans of grain and wagons of goods arrive, lifting the threat of starvation. In taverns from the Arbor to White Harbor, minstrels composed new songs of how the pirate king fell. Some gave credit to the cunning Onion Knight, others lauded the heroic ships of the allied fleet. But the common refrain was this: Euron Greyjoy, the Crow's Eye, had been undone by the very realm he tried to strangle. Yet in the silent places of the deep, beyond the reach of sunlight, the bones of the Silence rested. Among the seaweed and drifting debris, some said a patch of darkness stirred now and then, like a half-living thing. If one listened closely, they claimed, you could hear the faintest echo of laughter, a cruel, mocking cackle that the waves themselves seemed eager to drown. Whether it was the wind or something else, none could say. But those who heard it woke in a cold sweat, reminded that even nightmares that sink beneath the surface can sometimes rise again with the tide. And so ended, at least for that time, the reign of the pirate king upon the narrow sea. Westeros had paid a terrible toll in blood and gold, but they had reclaimed their freedom. For a while, the lords busied themselves with reconstruction, forging new trade agreements, and seeing that the watchposts along the coasts were well armed. The realm breathed as though awakening from a long nightmare, uncertain but hopeful that Euron's shadow would not fall upon them again. And in the hush of the night, sailors who passed through Blackwater Bay would sometimes glance at the dark water, remembering the terror once inflicted by the black-sailed Silence. Some spat over the side, cursing the name of Euron Greyjoy. Others crossed themselves, murmuring prayers to the drowned god or the Seven, just in case. Because in the drowned dreams of men, the black kraken's grin sometimes still lingered, bright as a single blue eye gleaming from the depths of an endless sea.